Hello, everyone. My name is Jennifer Gibson. I'm Director Curator of Gallery 1CO3, which is the campus art gallery of the University of Winnipeg. It's my pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar conversation with 5 members of the Collab Quilt Collective. This event is presented in conjunction with Lindsey Bond's Conversational Threads exhibition at Gallery 1CO3, which features a collaborative quilt in progress by 9 members of the collective. What better way to celebrate International Women's Day than to listen to the her stories that will be shared by today's speakers? But I would like to begin with acknowledging that we are gathered on Treaty 1 territory, the ancestral lands of the Anishinaabe, Innu, Anish-Innu, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the home of the Red River Métis. I also want to give gratitude for our water, which is sourced from Shoal Lake 40 First Nation. I want to take a moment to acknowledge Gallery 1CO3's position as part of a larger colonial system that has participated in the dispossession of Indigenous cultures, and to recognize that museums and galleries, including Gallery 1CO3, have long excluded Indigenous peoples and their voices. Gallery 1CO3 aims to redress this situation by foregrounding Indigenous curators, artists, and their perspectives, and also by presenting perspectives of non-Indigenous artists whose creative practices take to heart an ongoing commitment to reconciliation and decolonization. Indeed, the Collab Quilt Collective self-identify as artists, folks, parents, and grandparents who are sewing transformative textile conversations to unsettle divergent and overlapping colonial inheritances. The form of their conversational quilt creates space to unlearn, grapple, and build relationships with inherited materials, skills, and more than human neighbors. In striving to create more relational family legacies, collective members incorporate slow and diverse ecological material processes grounded in aspen parkland and prairie ecosystems. Their work acknowledges complex colonial harms and erasures while navigating interwoven histories across Indigenous territories in what is now known as Canada. So for today's format, collective founder Lindsey Bond will offer a few words, and then each of the collective members will speak about their work for about 5 to 7 minutes or so. We will hear from Michelle Wilson first, followed by Christelle Lanthier, then Kalia Turner-Beckman, Jacqueline Neighbours, and finally Lindsey. Following the presentations, there will be time for questions. So I certainly encourage you to submit your questions to the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. A couple of housekeeping items for today. Of course, you can see we have ASL interpretation, and there is captioning if you just click at the bottom of your screen to activate those captions. This event will be recorded and it will be made available on Gallery 1CO3's YouTube playlist in about a week's time. So now it's my pleasure to introduce Lindsey Bond. Lindsey Bond, she, her, is an intermedia artist mother born in Beaver Hills House, or Edmonton. Using slow textile and photographic processes, she intervenes in her white settler family archive to think through her responsibility as mother and settler descendant to remember and sew a relationship with Treaty 6 territory and the North Saskatchewan River. Lindsey recently defended her MFA thesis, Ecosystems of Inheritance, at the University of Alberta. She received her BFA in photography from Emily Carr University of Art and Design and studied visual communications at the Edinburgh College of Art in Scotland. Her artwork has been exhibited in T-Rex Southeast, Latitude 53, Harcourt House, Gallery 44, and the Richmond International Film and Media Arts Festival. And Lindsey also has certainly been an integral member of the arts community here on Treaty 1 territory, where she lived and worked with a number of arts organizations and practiced her work as an artist for close to a decade. So now it's my pleasure to hand it over to Lindsey.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jennifer. And thank you so much, Jenny, for interpreting. Really appreciate both of your words. I'm going to just share my screen. And just bear with me here, get myself sorted. There we go. There we are. Okay. Thanks for your patience. Okay, so yeah, I'm really pleased to be here. Thanks so much for organizing this talk, Jennifer. And I'm really also happy to welcome a few of the Collab Quilt members here today as part of the roundtable discussion and discuss some of the pieces that are being shown at 1CO3. So I just want to take a few minutes today to share a little bit about the background of the Collab Quilt Collective, speak a little bit to our process and how we meet up every month, and then introduce the 4 members who are generously taking time to be here today. So to begin, because I'm coming from a different treaty territory, I just want to situate myself. So I'm sitting in my home studio here in Amiskwichi, Waskahigan, meaning Beaver Hills House in Cree, also known as Edmonton, in Treaty 6 territory. So Beaver Hills House is a traditional gathering place for many indigenous nations, including the Nehiyaw, the Nistapi, Assiniboine, Nakota Sioux, the Métis Nation Region 4, and Inuit. So it's in this gathering place that I reflect on my family's engagement in and benefit from the erasure of Indigenous people in our family archives and on the land in Treaty 6 territory. So further, in my work in being a responsible settler and good relative, it includes respecting my relatives' experience and understanding the importance of retelling or restoring our family stories to include how our past family stories have upheld and perpetuated white supremacy through the uplifting of the pioneer hero narrative within a settler colonial framework. I also wish to share my deep gratitude for the Nehiyaw ways of knowing in Treaty 6 and for my deep respect for the teachers and elders who have been guiding me over the last few years. And so I say Nanaskamun to Elder Joanne Saddleback from Satellite Cree Nation, Knowledge Keeper Dale Saddleback from Maskwaci, as well as Dr. Dwayne Donald, who is Papachase Cree. I acknowledge and say thank you to the rivers, so Kisi, Saskatchewani, Seepi, and the Notanito Seepi, or the North Saskatchewan River and the Battle River. And I thank them for nourishing our more than human relatives and guiding me back to reframing my family narratives in this place. So the Collab Quilt Collective meetups concept was actually created from the process of working with my elderly aunts during 2019 to 2021. So during this time, I was working through my Master's of Fine Art thesis called Ecosystems of Inheritance at the University of Alberta. My aunts and I visited in person and online to literally open up our white settler family archive, housed in my great-grandmother's red rose tea tin. So stepping back about 4 years ago now, before I inherited the tea tin, I really had no idea about any of my family stories or my family history, where my family settled, any of these things. And so gathering with my grandmother, my aunts, really that was the greatest gift, was listening to them share their farm stories, as well as them passing down hand-me-down fabric. The process of listening to their stories and then sewing at home taught me how important listening is and how memory can be infused into material and how material can be the teacher and guide us, especially when there are differing viewpoints and opinions. So doing the work of remembering with my family archive and my aunts cautioned me to realize what stories were told and that there's many stories that have not been told. And as a self-taught and rather unconventional quilter, I began to develop individual quilt pieces that kind of puzzle out entanglements, as well as my complicity of my family stories and settler colonialism alongside the Battle River. And so from this experience, I formed the Collab Quilt meetups because I felt the need to continue to ask questions, but I also had to respect the boundaries of my family, who really are not asking any questions anymore. And so this workshop was an open call to a public community of makers, as well as sort of invites of folks that I knew who choose to keep decolonial conversations going, to unsettle prairie textiles, and so relationships with the land. So the Collab Quilt Collective is currently working on a conversational quilt that's constantly in progress. The makers are welcome to bring an inherited material, item, or skill to the group. They're welcome to join the group online conversations and also step away to focus on sewing their individual pieces from home. Over the last year or so, we've been meeting up almost every month. In the summer, we take a little bit of time off. I had my baby, so I took a little bit more time off too. But we specifically focus on sewing, as Sarah Hunt and Cindy Holmes write in their piece, Everyday Decolonization, sewing these critical family conversations. And so in our conversations, we might ask ourselves how to locate our solidarity within and across various family and community spaces, rather than only in more visible activist sites. And so Hunt and Holmes' discussion of daily acts, in our case, such as sewing and conversation, and how those sites can become a site of resistance and also align with and honor longstanding Indigenous and queer relationships with the land. In the Conversational Quilt project, we find ourselves working on pieces that question, challenge, and form a dialogue with our colonial inheritances. So the Conversational Quilt is a participatory art project. We have the virtual collective conversations and a personal making space component. So during our conversations, we focus on the material as a teacher, and we take steps to foster a safe environment for decolonial discussions by confronting traditional quilting patterns and encouraging collective learning through loving accountability. The slow process of handwork creates the time and space for reflexive conversation to develop between the makers and the materials, as well as between the collective members. As a kindred arts organization, Thinking Rock Arts states, slowing down with the textile-based practice instills the reflective pace in the maker and creates a connection with the handwork that develops and evolves over time. And so our project really does sort of ebb and flow, and some members choose to sort of stick with the group and meet every month, and other members kind of step away, take some time to figure out the process, the material, do their own grappling, figure out their family stories, and then come back. So it's really open type of space. So I'll just highlight a couple things about the project. So the material share that participants have engaged in was actually suggested by one of our members, Christelle, and the group adopted it as an exciting way to sow a shared material conversation, taking on the labor of each other's inheritances. So the material share creates accountability and reciprocity, or loving accountability, that connects the group in the separate sewing spaces. It helps us to be in conversation with each other's processes and promote understanding of our shared family histories. As well as choosing to let the material lead the research, frees us up from the standard sort of facilitator-participant dynamic and shifts that reflexive work back to the participant. And finally, fostering a safe environment for decolonial discussions is really the core to the health of the project. So earlier in the conversations, we created a type of participant agreement so we can begin creating safe space for our discussions. So this agreement, as you see here on the slide, has evolved kind of since our first meeting and includes making room for safe collective conversations, as well as having separate grappling spaces. As well, there's a focus on listening, listening and a balance and respect held in check between members with the loving accountability. And then these moments can connect the group and help us to be in conversation with each other's processes, sit with uncomfortable tensions, and reconnect. So thank you for listening a little bit about the Collab Quilt Collective. I'm very pleased now to introduce a few of the members of the Collab Quilt Collective who have generously, again, taken time to be here. So I'll just read some of their bios, and I'll start with Michelle, move to Christelle, then Kalia, and then Jacqueline. So Michelle Wilson is an artist and mother currently residing as an uninvited guest on Treaty 6 territory in London, Ontario. She defended her SSHRC and OGS funded PhD in May 22 at the University of Western Ontario. As a feminist of settler descent, studying in colonial institutions, Wilson's dissertation investigated and confronted the Euro-American archive and how other animals' bodies are employed to convey colonial knowledge systems, with their stories of survival used to perpetuate myths of settler saviors. Michelle's ongoing projects include leading the Remediation Soils Project and the Coves Collective, a group of artist activists engaged in actions on the land that challenge ideas of ownership, conservation. She is a postdoctoral scholar with the Conservation of Reconciliation Partnership at the University of Guelph. Next is Christelle Lantier, a Franco-Manitoban multidisciplinary Métis artist, mother, shepherdess, and caretaker of land on Treaty 1 territory. Her work focuses on cyclical functions of a never-ending cycle. Christelle is passionate about turning sunlight and grass into textile through a holistic and regenerative approach of land management and her family farm. She accomplishes this by means of her grazing flock of Rideau Arcot, Romney, Shetland, and Rambouillet sheep, and their beautiful wool that they grow. Pardon me, I'm still learning the names. That wool is then turned into yarn or felt that go on to becoming local textiles. Recently, having acquired a large needle felting equipment, Christelle fabricates intentionally created zero waste creations that can be utilized and then entirely composted once spent. Additionally, Christelle explores the media of photography and snow sculpting, having coordinated the International Snow Sculpture Symposium in Winnipeg for the last 10 years. And I'm pleased to say that in April, her first book with Anna Hunter, titled Sheep, Shepherd, and Land, is launching, so congratulations. And Kalia Turner Beckman, pronouns she, her, lives and works on Treaty 6 territory in Amiskwaciwâskahikan, or Edmonton, Alberta. She disrupts the exploitative global wool industry by creating yarns that are ethical and sustainable at every step of the supply chain, working directly with local sheep farms and fiber mills, and using all natural dyes in her work. Kalia studied sustainable development at the University of St. Andrews, communication for development at Malmo University, and is a current student in the Master Spinner program at Olds College. She began her exploration into local wool as a co-founder of the Alberta Yarn Project from 2014 to 2020, and launched her own sustainable yarn brand, Luddite Yarn, in 2020. And Jacqueline Hébert is a Franco-Manitoban artist who works mostly in installation, craft, photo, and media art. In 2015, an interest in slow design and functional art led her to launch Atelier Nook. The goal of this ongoing craft-based project is not mass production, but a way to create handmade objects and build relationships with people through making and design collaborations. She has presented her work both nationally and internationally and holds an MFA in Fibers and Materials from Concordia University, a BFA in Film and Media from Emily Carr University, and a BA in Anthropology from the University of Manitoba. Okay, I'm going to pass it over to Michelle.
Thanks, Lindsay.
For sure.
Is it possible to start with the big map?
Yes.
Perfect. Oh, perfect. They're both on the same page. Lovely. Yeah, I want to thank Lindsay especially for inviting me to be a part of this project. I'm going to talk a little bit about my practice in general, and then the stories that come out of the piece that I made. So settler inheritance is something I often grapple with in my work, but I have been primarily concerned with what we've inherited in a kind of macro sense. For example, in the map you see here, it's an interactive textile piece I called Forced Migration. And it has audio stories embedded in the piece that follow a lineage of bison as they are extracted from their families and the land, reconceived as property and shuffled from owner to owner, eventually ending up in the hands of Parks Canada. I created this work partly because as uninvited guests on Indigenous land, we're continually told that national parks and our conservation system in general are a benevolent inheritance from our settler ancestors. And I would say we are wrongly told that. So we're told this through archives created and maintained by parks and conservation societies, which focus on quote unquote charismatic species like the bison. So in forced migration, I mine these archives to create alternative stories of the bison's path to conservation. The audio essays reveal how ideologies around capitalism, human exceptionalism, and white supremacy have influenced settler relations to the more than human world. And so the threads that are sewn on there, some of them are conductive threads. So when you touch different segments of that journey, it plays the corresponding audio piece. And I should say each strand represents a real life of a bison that is recorded in the archive. So it starts with 6 and goes to over 6,000 in that final segment. So they're all counted and marking, a real life. And some of the strings are cut because those bison did not make it from one place to the next. They died along the way. So in another performance-based piece, I collaborated with Casey Adams on, I was thinking about how so many of us settlers come to know bison through taxidermy and what that says about the desire for mastery and dominance and the erasure of violence, and also how it erases the life, kin, and context of a being and turns them into an example of a classification system. This way of knowing is another kind of inheritance, and it's one that I don't want to pass on to my own child. So in this work over 3 days, I deconstructed a taxidermy bust of a young bison bull. And I subsequently did my best to repair the hide and to care for him. Then I sent him off to Casey and we made this 2-channel call and response video where she receives the bison and gives a teaching around the bison and around clay to her mother and her son on the land. And then I received that teaching through the video and pass it along to my daughter in my own way on the land here in so-called London, not far from the Deshkin Seavey or Antler River. So all that is to say that these inherited stories are kind of general to white settlers, but this invitation from Lindsey to participate in this collaborative quilt making was a push to think about the specificity of my own family and their experiences, which was challenging because my family does not talk about the past. They don't talk much and they definitely don't talk about the past. And those that did hold those stories have died. So I guess that for better or for worse, I am the storyteller now. So this is kind of what I've cobbled together from what I've learned from listening and found out through the limited genealogical and archival research I've been able to do. So most of my family seems to have originated in England and in the Brittany region of France. They were uninvited guests on the lands of the Wabanaki and the Kayaka, sorry, I'm a little nervous, my words don't come out easily, for several generations. So, and many of my ancestors are now buried in what is known by the English inhabitants as Clarenceville. And I have to admit that this background in history is fairly new to me or less familiar than the places where I've lived. I never lived in Quebec. So among those ancestors are my paternal grandmother, Marion Adelaide Wilson, who was married to Harry G. Wilson. And I took as a starting point a brooch I inherited from Marion, and you can see her initials stitched into the piece. It's actually the only thing I have from my grandparents. She died when my father was in his late teens, and her husband, Harry, died a few years before her, long before I was born. In 1911, when he was 13 years old and his brother Bill was 12, they were taken from their parents or surrendered due to extreme poverty, it's not really clear, and put on the Empress of Britain, a ship leaving Liverpool, and were sent to a home in Knowlton, Quebec. From there, they were leased out to farmers to work the land and advance the project of settler colonialism. I don't know if they were separated or kept as a pair in their labors. Harry and Bill never saw their parents again, though family lore says that there was a sister who was left behind. My dad never spoke about his father except to say that he had a glass eye and didn't say much. They grew up poor in a tenement in Westmount, a now very posh neighborhood, English neighborhood of Montreal. He seems to have fonder memories of his mother, Marion, but also many regrets. He once told me that they fought when she was at the end of her life in the hospital. He had bought a motorcycle, which is hard to believe if you have ever met my father, and that was fine, but he had taken to wearing a leather jacket. I think this is like the 1960s, which would make people think that he looked like a thug. And his mother died shortly after. When I was a teenager, my father stopped speaking to me. I lived with him until I was 19, but he would not talk to me unless it was absolutely necessary. And I think the one exception that I can think of was to ask me why I had to look the way that I did, with the hair and the piercings, and why I had to embarrass him by looking like such a freak. And what would people think? And so I see these patterns repeating. When I married a cis man and had a child, he wanted to speak to me again, though he still couldn't bring himself to come to my wedding. And so this piece is made out of a deconstructed vintage sweater that I wore to my wedding. And I think it helps me tell the stories about what I've inherited, the violence of class politics and the settler colonial state, but also what I refuse to hold precious, to protect and to preserve. It represents to me the understanding of family that I will remake and hand down to my own daughter by acknowledging the blood like rivers that connects us, but also the families we make through love and care and attention. That's it. Thank you for listening.
Thanks so much, Michelle. I'm going to just pass it on to Christelle. I have stopped sharing my screen. Yeah, okay. Let's see here. Christelle, are you there? Awesome. We can't hear you.
Sorry about that. I was just looking to share my screen. There we go. Does that work? Okay. So, yeah. Oh, I can't go back and forth. That's fine. Sorry about the technology thing. Everybody can hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay.
And see your image.
Okay, great. I don't think I can toggle through my images, so I'll just have to go back and forth. Yeah, for the Quilt Collab, I was interested in immediately in this image, and this is an image of a spider, an orb weaver spider that I took in our field. So we have our farm on Treaty 1 territory in Poche-aux-Lièvres. We sit on Poche-aux-Lièvres near the historical Dawson Trail. And Poche-aux-Lièvres is a traditional Métis hunting area. My parents were never hunters, nor were my grandparents. That skill kind of was passed, and I guess from further generations was lost. Um, but what they did, my parents did pass on, was a great respect for the land, and all living beings, and that was ingrained in me from a very young age. So I have this passion and always looking at the small critters and looking at the weavings and the interconnectedness and how everything has its place. And this image was taken in our field here on the farm in a year where there was quite an extreme drought. And commercial farms all around us were experiencing extreme destruction. Monoculture farms were having grasshopper problems through the roof. And at our place, a little further away, our field was filled with these little spiders. And in the morning dew, the webs just sparkled with these little water pearls, and they were sitting there. And what I noticed, and excuse my poor toggling skills, is that these spiders were they were eating the grasshoppers in our fields. So here, let me see if I can pull up the picture. There we go. So these spiders were actually protecting our fields. And I really saw this interconnectedness of this juxtaposition of a mother spider, taking care of unwanted guests, but all, or not necessarily unwanted guests, but making use of this year of bounty, I guess, with the grasshoppers. So I really want to show that in my quilt piece. I'm just gonna stop sharing for a sec. So, oh, my video's off. Yeah, that was kind of the start of the Quilt Collab when Lindsey brought us on. I was really thinking about how that circle that they create in these beautiful webs in our fields are interwoven. And then I also connected that idea with the idea of harvesting animals. And on our farm, we harvest animals. We harvest our sheep. We use them for fiber and for meat, so they're dual purpose. And that kind of idea, or that need for me, I guess, to utilize the full animals came from that respect of taking that life. So I really wanted to dive into learning how to tan. So I started tanning about 5 years ago, and in starting to learn how to tan, it really connected me to something that was a bit deeper. And it was really sheep that introduced me to that. And since then, I've been tanning deer and sheep as well as other small animals. But that work kind of led me to this like blood memory or some sort of deeper connected muscle memory that I had that I just had to keep doing. And so when I saw that spider web in my field, it also made me think of this image of this is cull fat. So cull fat is inside of an animal. I'll pull up the image in just a sec, sorry. Cull fat is the fat that covers all the organs inside of an animal. And it very much resembles a spider web in a way, but it protects and covers, but it also nourishes. And so here, I'll share this image. So this is the image of cull fat. So both this cull fat that is inside of an animal when you do butchering, but also in juxtaposition with the spider web, I found were very similar, but also linked to sorry, the some of the skills of my ancestors. So my grandfather was a butcher, and my grandmother's knitting, and so these interwoven fiber, and now with the fiber and the sheep, it all sort of started coming together into one piece. So throughout this piece, I'm working with the collab. My grandmother actually passed away, and I was given a doily from her, and so again, the idea of setting a table or providing food came up, and so this is the process of the piece here. So this doily was given to me. So I wanted to include some of the sheep hide tanning. So this piece here down in the corner is from the hide tanning of the sheep that introduced me to that work. And then the felted fiber, but all encompassing as a piece of that spider in the field, I felt would connect well together. So in the end, it came out as this. Very good there. So yeah, so just the interconnectedness, and I wanted to include some knitted threads and some pearls, some beads connected to the beadwork that my mom has passed to me since I was 3 or 4 years old. We started playing with beadworks and beads and all those inherited skills and that blog work memory, and all that weaving together kind of, I guess, created this piece. So yeah, that is what we came up with. I can pass it back to Lindsey.
Thanks so much, Chris. It's beautiful. I'm going to pass it on to Kalia. Would you like to share your screen?
Hi. I'll share my screen at the end to show some process shots of the final piece, but I'll just talk a bit about my piece until then. I don't know, Lindsay, if you want to bring up a picture of the finished item. But...
For sure.
Okay, so I'll start by talking a bit about who I am and how I'm approaching this work. I run a local yarn business here in Treaty 6 territory in Edmonton. I got into this work because I was an environmental activist in my early 20s and did a lot of work around food security and like local food sourcing, sustainable agriculture. I studied sustainable development in my undergrad. And through all of that, knitting was my hobby. And I started asking myself why I wasn't applying the same concepts that I was applying to my food, to my knitting, because I'm from Alberta. And this is a very farming rich settler culture. We have a lot of sheep in Alberta. I thought surely we must be producing yarn, but I couldn't find any and I wasn't able to work with it. So I embarked on this on this project called the Alberta Yarn Project to find and source local yarn, and discovered that the wool industry in Alberta and globally is completely broken. That the kind of settler colonial capitalist way that we deal with resource extraction and commodities means that the Canadian wool system as it's set up right now is that farmers are paid global market prices for their wool, and which is around like 30 cents a pound, which for a lot of farmers in this area doesn't even cover the cost of driving the wool to the depot where they sell it. The wool is then shipped to Ontario where it's graded, and then it's shipped to China where it goes into global processing and eventually is sold back to us. So I started looking for local sheep farmers that were growing wool to see if I could buy yarn directly from them. And I found that because they weren't able to sell their wool for a reasonable price, they were often burning it in the field or composting it on their land, and it was going to waste. So I started making yarn. That's kind of how I got here. So when Lindsey approached me for this project, I knew obviously I was going to use some of the yarn that I was making in my work. And this project also spoke to an experiment that I had done in 2020 around my settler identity and my relationship with the land that I live on here in Edmonton. At the time, I was living in South Edmonton, right near the Blackmud Creek Ravine, and I had been reading the book Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer, where she delves into this relationship with the land that is more than just not causing harm to the land, but actually living in a reciprocal, beneficial relationship with the land and the other beings that live there. And that was a revelation for me, that as an environmental activist, the kind of inherited idea about how to live responsibly in our environment that I had was that the best that we can possibly do is not cause harm. That all of my actions to live responsibly were around minimizing my harm to the environment. So this idea that I could actually develop a reciprocal beneficial relationship with the environment, that my presence could be helpful to other plants and animals and ecosystems, was enlightening and very freeing for me. So I started a dye experiment, because I'm a natural dyer as well in my yarn work. Over the spring and summer of 2020, I went into the Blackmud Creek Ravine and ethically foraged dyed plants. So I experimented with different plants that could be used for natural dyes, and I can show you some samples of what I came up with. Each month from about April until September, I challenged myself to find at least one new plant to dye with. And these are some of the colors that I was able to come up with. Lots of varying shades of yellows and greens and beiges and grays. I was using plants like tansy and goldenrod and dogwood. I was specifically looking for invasive weeds that were brought here by other white settlers that have taken over the Blackmud Creek Ravine and that are choking out native species. So that was my focus for how to have a beneficial impact on the ecosystem, was to forage mainly the invasive weeds and other native species that were growing in great abundance. And while I was in the area, I was also picking up litter, trying to leave the land better than how I found it. And near the end of the experiment, I was getting tired of all of the yellows and greens. They're beautiful, but I was searching for other colors. And I found a plant called northern bedstraw, which is a native species, which is related to madder. And madder root is like a traditional red dye that is used, or it has traditionally been used across Europe, where my ancestors come from. But the northern bedstraw was not growing in great enough abundance that I felt like it would be responsible for me to forage it. And so I approximated the color that I could get from northern bedstraw with some imported matter that I had in my stash at home. And this is the kind of reddy orange color that I came up with. So that's where the colors came from. The specific wool that I was dyeing these colors on, all of the colored yarn is dyed on fin wool, which was sourced from the Fort Saskatchewan sheep. There is a flock of sheep that I work with that live in Fort Saskatchewan, which is a town just north of Edmonton. They live there in the summer, grazing the public lands at the Fort Heritage Precinct as an environmentally friendly land management system. Instead of mowing all of the grass in this kind of museum area, they have a flock of sheep. So I buy their wool, and that's where the colored wool came from. And then the gray wool in the background is Shetland wool that was sourced from a farm near Toefield, which is about an hour outside of Edmonton. So that's the wool. The next level of meaning that I was delving into in this is, so I chose to do a knitted square. I don't have any inherited material from my family, but I have inherited my skill of knitting. My mother's mother was from Scotland, and she taught my mother how to knit, and my mother taught me how to knit. And the patterns that I'm using in this square have also been kind of mined from my inherited knitting cultures. So the star pattern is quite a ubiquitous knitting pattern that shows up a lot in Scandinavian knitting and also in Northern Scotland. And I've been working with it a lot in my work because it also shows up everywhere in Ukrainian imagery. And my partner is Ukrainian. He moved to Edmonton from Ukraine about 8 years ago, and we recently brought his father over to live with us because of the Ukrainian war. And so I've been working with this star image and thinking about how it shows up in these different cultures of folk art and what makes it feel more Ukrainian or more Scottish or more Scandinavian. And playing around with like the geometric patterns that go behind it, and thinking through how my my mother's family that comes from Scotland and my father's family that comes from Scandinavia and my partner's family that comes from Ukraine, how all of these are blending together in my current family home and how we're expressing our culture. So that's where that came from. And as we were working through our pieces in the conversational meetings, we were talking a lot about the land survey grid in the prairie provinces and how this grid structure that settler colonialism has imposed on the land influences the geography and how we live here. And we were all kind of thinking through how the grid shows up in our pieces, if it does, and how to kind of play with those theories. And another one of the members who wasn't able to join us today, Kiwi, asked me what would happen if I kind of tipped the grid on its head. So originally, here I can bring up my process shots now. Just share my screen. So the image on the left is what I originally came up with, that was trying to blend the Ukrainian, Scottish, and Scandinavian versions of this star pattern. And it was very, very grid-like. And so Kiwi asked what would happen if I kind of tipped everything over, and that opened everything up, which I thought was a really interesting metaphor for the way that we were talking through our work on these pieces and kind of having an expansive collaborative approach to what was happening. And this like kind of tipping over felt like an unsettling to me. which is really interesting because in the final installation, I had in my mind the way that my square was going to be presented, but I didn't tell Lindsey which side was up. And in the final installation, it has been put on its side again. And my initial thought was, oh no, they did it wrong. I should let them know to fix it. And then I thought, no, actually, that is the way that this piece has evolved from the very beginning, that every time I think I know what I'm making, it kind of just gets tipped over and it becomes something new because of this collaborative conversation that we've been having. So I really like that happened. I think that's all I have to say about my piece. That's the kind of whole evolution of where it came from and what I was thinking about as I was working on it.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Kalia. I'll pass it on to Jacqueline. Would you like to share your screen?
Hello. 1 second. Okay. Oop. Okay. My piece was, well, I guess when I joined the group, I guess I should start there, that I didn't really know what I wanted to make for like a really long time. I sat in the meetings and was like, I don't know, I'm not sure what I want to make. And one day I was basically tidying up my daughter's room. I just moved back to Manitoba in 2020 because of the pandemic. I've been living in Toronto and Montreal for 10 years prior to that. Anyways, that's a whole other long story. But anyways, I was tidying up my daughter's room and found this coin purse that was my grandmother's, my paternal grandmother's coin purse that she gave to me when I was 5. And I thought, oh, this could be an interesting piece to recreate. And it sort of brought back all these memories about my grandmother, Maria. And so that's sort of where the jumping off point for my piece came from. In what I decided to do was that I decided to learn how to bead. I've never done any beading before. This is my first beading project. And so part of the idea, so my grandmother was born in 1918 in a small town called Saint-Pierre-Joly, which is south of Winnipeg. It's to tell you a bit about the history of the town. It was originally settled by Métis people in the 1870s. It was a place for wintering cattle from places like Saint-Vital and Saint-Norbert. And so they would spend a lot of time in this area because there were quite large forests where they could cut down the trees for heat. And there was also a lot of good trapping in the area as well. And then sort of after Manitoba joined the Canadian Confederation in the 1870s, there was also colonization societies like the St. Boniface Colonization Society that decided to bring in a lot of Francophone or French-speaking groups from other places to settle the land. So there was a lot of French speakers from Quebec, for example, and from Massachusetts, who came to settle in small towns like Saint-Pierre. And so, you know, of course, Métis and Francophone groups sort of grew up or were living side by side, I'm sure. And there was a lot of racism, and a lot of Métis groups had to hide their identity. So this is just to give you a bit of background on the town of Saint-Pierre. It still is, I believe, a majority Francophone community. Both my parents are from there. And so I spent a lot of time in this town growing up. And so my grandmother, who gave me this coin purse, she had 9 children. You know, that was sort of a common thing for French Canadian families at the time, to have large families. And also growing up on a farm, you needed extra help to cultivate the land. And so the piece that I ended up making at the same time as I was trying to decide like how I wanted to remake this coin purse as a side project, or as one of my hobbies is to make leather bags. And so I was in conversation with a friend of mine who happens to be Métis, and we decided that it would be interesting to do a skill share. I would make her a leather bag, and she would teach me how to do beading. And so I decided to recreate the coin purse in this way. And so I just had a few process shots so you can see how the process of making this came to be. So you just start with drawing your image on a piece of transfer paper, and then start beading on top of it. And then slowly take the paper away as you work. And so it was a really interesting process to make this. I find that my aesthetic tends to be fairly graphic and minimalist in general. So, but the beading really gives the object like an interesting tactility. And is also very hard on your fingers. So this is an image of my fingers where basically like the needle was going into it. So now I have very good calluses for the next time that I might want to try beading. I also made myself a finger protector out of leather to sort of minimize my pain as I was making. So yeah, so I just wanted to show you a few other images as it was going along. And I know that the final shape isn't like exactly perfect, but it's pretty close. So I think I'll stop there because I think we're running out of time. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jackie. Jennifer, I'm looking at the time, and maybe I'll just pass it on to the questions, because I know that we only have about 15 minutes left.
Yeah, so thanks so much, everybody, for sharing so generously about your work and the processes, the inspirations, and the context. I'm not seeing any questions yet in the Q&A, so please do feel free to put your questions into the Q&A. I think one of the things maybe in the meantime is I'll just make a comment and maybe ask a question. I found in listening Michelle, or sorry, I guess it was to Kalia about your work and how it's these conversations with others in the group that really ended up influencing your piece, as well as your heritage and your existing interests and working with environmental sustainability. I find that story really interesting in how it there was that piece that that it sort of transformed your piece through your conversations with Kiwi, but then also with Lindsey installing the piece differently. That's really cool. That's a really really neat surprise to hear, and I'm sure for you too.
Yeah.
As you expressed. I guess I'm wondering about other folks in the group too. If you might share how your conversations impacted your final work, or did they? So that's kind of just to throw that out there to anybody else who might want to share that. So Michelle.
Yeah, I think the conversation about the legacy of the grid and how those metaphors have been made by others about the grid, the land allotment being opposed on the ground, and how that is like the warp and weft of fabric or quilts. Really, I mean, brought meaning to things I was already doing. Because I was already working with like industrial felted wool as opposed to woven fabrics. So it created another layer to something I was already doing, but it also inspired me to take that, I think, rabbit wool sweater and look at how to felt something that was already woven. So to kind of disrupt that by throwing it in the washing machine with like your old sneakers on high and like breaking apart those kind of bonds and reforming them in a new way.
Yeah. Oh. Thanks so much. Lindsey, Jacqueline, Christelle, any ways that your work was impacted materially or conceptually through the conversations?
Well, I'll go. I think that the idea of the material share really shifted my work in a really lovely way. So Christelle had at the very beginning said, hey, why don't we share these materials? And it turned out to be just a really awesome idea. I know other members had also sort of switched and shared materials too. And so I had done a material share with Christina Battle and Alma Vischer, and had given some of my fabric the fabric that my aunts had passed down and handed it to them, and then they handed theirs to me. And I think the magic really that happened was making space in my piece for their fabric, because it was unfamiliar fabric to me. I think Christina had passed over, it was like a blue spandex from her mom. It had interesting, it was like red stitching for the lining. And then Alma had done some really beautiful eco printing. I think it was either with cotton. I think it was a type of cotton or a blend. And yeah, so to sort of like sew in their pieces into the whirlpool that I made was, yeah, it really, I thought a lot about sort of my white settler ancestry or heritage, I guess, and then making space for Black settler, story fabric, as well as eco-printed fabric, so that working with the plants from Alma's backyard. That was pretty awesome.
Nice, thanks. I'm not sure, Jacqueline or Christelle, if you have anything to add there, but if not, we do have a number of questions actually that have come up in the Q&A. So I could go to that. Let's see. Oh, so Sydney says, thank you for all of your amazing work. Are you accepting members to the collective? And if so, how can you join?
Absolutely. It's super open. Anyone can join anytime. Yeah, we can do maybe an email list, and I can just send a message out and add you to the email list, I guess. So I don't know if Kathy maybe wants to collect the emails, or maybe they can email to you, Jennifer, or straight to me. I'm fine with that too.
Yeah, absolutely.
There a
You can
chat?
contact me and that would be great. And then yeah, because actually just further to that, there are quite a few members of the collective, right? I'm not sure how many, because some people come and go, as you said, or they're active at certain points and not at others. I mean, there's work by 9 members of the collective in the exhibition, but there are more members, right? So,
Yeah, I think at times there's been like 18
wow.
people, but not in the same room, but kind of in discussion, whether it's through email or attending the group kind of meetup. Yeah, it's pretty cool.
Val is asking, will you be continuing with the project? Do you see, you will be, do you see some sort of, I think we talked about this before. What do you see as sort of like, is there like any kind of a culmination? I mean, this piece that's in the gallery is called the Collaborative Quilt in Progress. And I know we had, and you and the members, other members of the collective, you'd all talked about maybe putting the works all physically together as one quilt, but in the gallery, of course, these pieces are actually all separate. Anything that maybe anybody wants to add about sort of future plans? For exhibition or for, you know, outside of like obviously the conversations that you're continuing to have on Zoom, any other goals or plans?
I don't know. I feel like I think just coming together for this first thing was like such a big jump from what we've been like doing together, you know, in a way. But it's cool. It's like I could totally see it becoming a book too. Like I think that the writing about the works is really fascinating and insightful, and is a neat way of like connecting all of the work to each other and to the stories that they're trying to talk about.
Yeah, wow, that would be amazing. And what about a website? Is there possibility for that as well, maybe in the future?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the participants had a lot of different ideas. So some people were really interested in showing the pieces in person. Some people wanted them to only be shown in their the territory in which they were made, and that was really important connection. And that by taking them outside of the territory, it would lose a certain type of context and the relationality to that treaty. And so we're still very much in conversation about it, and it's kind of this kind of ebb and flow. Yeah, and so some folks who, yeah, I guess who were ready and wanted to share their pieces are in the exhibition now, and others are still working, and others didn't want to be shown in this one. So I mean, it'd be really cool to have more of a final exhibition or something. But again, we're all kind of it's up to everyone. So
Yeah,
see how
and
it
I
goes.
mean, it's not necessarily that there'd be I guess the way the collective works too is not necessarily that there'd be a final, right? Because this is all about these continuing conversations and keeping that going. And I could see members, as you said, like kind of coming and going and continuing that way. So a nice, lovely comment from Jamie Black, who says, "Hi all, amazing and thoughtful, soulful work. Loved listening to you all share such important work, remaking, mending historical narratives." And then there's a question from Carolyn to Jacqueline. What is your favorite medium to work with? I love the quilt. That was the background of your photos.
Oh, thank you. I don't know. I think I'm like one of those people that's a bit of a like too multidisciplinary maybe, or like I'm just like or maybe it's like this postmodernist, or like, you know, this kind of idea of like the idea and then the material kind of like, what do I want to make, and then try to figure out how to make it kind of thing. So yeah, I feel like I've been doing, or I learned how to quilt in 2021. It was like a pandemic thing. So I've been really enjoying how to learn how to quilt in the last few years. And I could totally see playing with beads more being a lot of fun too. And I also really like working with leather to make bags, because it like, plays with my perfectionism problem of like, because things need to be really squared and like, so that's fun. Thanks for the nice comment, Carolyn.
Nice. Speaking of media, Lindsey, prior to your shift into working with, with quilting materials and embroidery and so forth, you worked in photo-based work. And could you share maybe a couple of comments on maybe how you've continued, or maybe not continued, well, lens-based, video-based work, how that still maybe makes, you've got space for that in your practice as it's shifted, or how that's changed?
Sure. Yeah, I'd say for probably, since 2000 or earlier, I've been working primarily in photography and video. And and the, like, sort of like Jacqueline was saying, the pandemic shifts things, right? So my son and I were in our basement suite. I was working at my kitchen table, and of course you can video edit and photo edit. But I just sort of felt the need to work in textiles because I was working with my aunts. And so my aunts, their understanding of a visual medium was cross stitch and quilting, and then a little bit of embroidery. And so I kind of took it upon myself to learn how to sew. And so it's interesting though how prominent photography, I guess, I can never totally leave it alone because the whole basis of the textiles is based on a photo archive. And so it really kind of conceptualizes the archive in a way, or even, I guess, shifts it, what am I trying to say? Like the stories that are from the archive, but they were oral stories that my aunts had shared. And so it took it away from that visual medium into that oral sort of storytelling medium, and then into the textile. So back into kind of this tangible textile that was restored. But of course there's room, I think, for all these mediums. Like I liked what Jacqueline was saying, how it just kind of depends on the project and the concept, and then the medium ends up finding its way. I totally agree with that way of working.
Yeah. And then, of course, for Christelle, I mean, you work in many media. Did you want to maybe share with folks your work in other media? And then maybe a question is like, do you see them intersecting? Do you see a space for these different materials that you use to intersect?
Absolutely. I think I'm a little bit like Jacqueline. I kind of like like to work with all kinds of mediums. I actually one of the first things I ever worked in was I was a goldsmith like another life ago. And so I'm always shifting and changing my mediums. I went from being a goldsmith to doing photography and sculpture work, and then now I'm a farmer somehow, and I'm working with fiber, a lot more fiber, and now that I've fallen really deep into hide tanning, and I'm really enjoying hide tanning, and I'm a person that really enjoys going back. I think somebody else said that the beginning of the process, like, okay, I like this piece of jewelry, but how is that made? Oh, it's from metal. How is that metal extracted? Oh, how is that metal extracted? Oh, you have to like, so same with fiber, like with hide tanning, oh, I like working with leather. Oh, but how is the leather made? Like, I want to go back to I love the process. Does that make sense? So yeah, I'm always, going back to that, but I'm really enjoying materials that have less impact. That's been like what a really big thing for me is like things that are compostable or that go back to the land or ephemeral. And I'm playing a lot with that right now, and I really enjoy the non-permanency of certain things and how you have it for a certain amount of time and eventually it will go back to the land. So try to really minimize impact and work with materials that maybe won't leave much of a trace.
Yeah, which of course also takes me back to Kalia's work and your thinking about that as well, and how I know we're kind of coming to the end of our time here, but I just I mean, I think we could keep talking for quite a while actually, but I know people on the call have to go, so sadly I'll have to wrap it up. But I do want to thank everyone, you all, for your time and for sharing your practices today, and thanks to all who attended. So yes, and thank you also for allowing this event to be recorded so that other people can take it in. Thanks also to Jenna Lee very much for interpreting today, and to Evan for helping us with all the tech support. So with that, I guess we'll have to sign off for now, and maybe in the future we'll find a way to do this again. But for now, thanks very much, everybody, and happy International Women's Day, and
Thank
take care.
you.